This week we're going to be studying the anatomy of the heart. One of the things that we covered in the lecture side of lab is the electrical activity of the heart. I wanted to share this GIF with you a little bit. This week we're going to be looking at the anatomy. So this particular GIF, it shows the two upper chambers, which are called the atria. Atria is plural, each one is an atrium. And then when they contract, they are in systole, and systole is the word that we use to describe the contraction of the heart muscle. So when the atria are in systole, they contract and they push blood into the ventricles. And the ventricles need to be relaxed in order to receive that blood. So while the atria are in systole, the ventricles are in diastole. So atria are in systole, ventricles are in diastole, they fill up. And then the ventricles go into systole, they contract, and they push blood into the major arteries while the atria are in diastole. So back and forth. Atrial systole with ventricular diastole, then ventricular systole, moving blood out into the major arteries. Okay. By the way, it's correct to say atrial systole, but if you ever are reading and the textbook just says during systole, blah, 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 they mean ventricular systole because ventricular systole is the most important stage of the heart contraction. So let's look a little bit at the anatomy of the heart. In your second lab, you learned about the thoracic cavity, and you learned the thoracic cavity was separated from the abdominal cavity by this band of muscle called the diaphragm. The diaphragm is really important for breathing, and we'll be learning that in our next lab. You also learned that there was a space between the lungs, and that space between the lungs was called the mediastinum. And you learned that there were a number of things in the mediastinum, and we're learning them in more detail in this week's lab. In the mediastinum, there's the trachea. That's next week. But there's also the vena cava, there's also the aorta, and there is the heart. And the heart is inside of the mediastinum, but it's inside of its own bag. Remember this from that lab? It is inside of the pericardium. Well, a little more detail you need to know about the pericardium. The pericardium, I asked you when I described it the first time to imagine it as a big bubblegum bubble, and like your fist is going to be the heart, and you push it into that bubblegum bubble, and then part of the bubblegum would be stuck to your fist, and the rest of it would be farther away. The bubblegum bubble is the pericardium. The pericardium has got two layers. The part of the pericardium that is actually attached to the heart, you really can't peel it away, is called the epicardium. Epicardium. But it is also known as the visceral pericardium. So if I said, what is the part of the sac that covers the heart that stays attached to the heart? Visceral pericardium or epicardium. Now, the part of the bubblegum bubble that's farther away, that is the parietal pericardium. And the parietal pericardium I might describe as the loose membrane that surrounds the heart, or the part of the pericardium that's farther away from the heart, something like that, okay? And that's the parietal pericardium. The parietal pericardium has got different layers, and I don't ask you to know them, like the fibrous pericardium. But the pericardium does attach to the heart to the diaphragm, and you should be very glad. If I instantly could remove your pericardium, you would suddenly start feeling your heart beating in your chest, even when you're sitting there very quietly right now. And why is that? That's because the heart kind of dangles in your chest from these major arteries. So if it was not attached to the diaphragm by the pericardium, every time your heart beats, it would be like swinging around inside of your chest, kind of bonking into things, and you can feel it. But you can't feel it because unless you really exercise hard, because of the pericardium. Okay. Now, we need to know the four chambers of the heart. Let's go here. The four chambers of the heart. The upper chambers, each one is called an atrium. Atrium is single, so the plural for them is atria. So the right atrium is on the right, sorry, bad color. The right atrium is on the right side of the heart. Remember, when you're looking at the model sitting there in front of you, or this image, it is as if you're looking at someone in front of you, right? And this is my right hand. So that when you're looking at me, yeah, it's backwards, right? So it always hurts my feelings to have to take off a full point because someone calls the right atrium the left atrium. Remember, it's your left hand, but this is a person standing in front of you. That's their right side. So the right atrium and the left atrium. And when they contract, when they are in systole, they fill up the ventricles, okay? And the ventricles are the lower chambers of the heart. They look bigger and they are much stronger when they contract. And the right ventricle pumps into the right atrium pumps into the right ventricle. The left atrium pumps into the left ventricle. Okay, let's go back a little bit. Okay, when we're looking at the outside, the heart is clearly not symmetrical like a Valentine heart. It does not look like that. As a matter of fact, it's not even as simple as some of the diagrams that are in your textbook. The right side of the heart, it is on the right side, but it's also on the front. So all of this, let me use a better color. All of this right here, all of that is all right ventricle. And this is the right atrium. The left ventricle, it is on the left side, but it's also kind of in the back. And the left atrium, when the heart is closed like this, you can barely see it. Now, one of the things that I wanted to show you on this is the auricle. Do you remember when we did the parts of the ear? Sure, this part of the ear is called the auricle. Well, early anatomists, they thought it looked like this part of the heart had ears on it. Those ears are actually very interesting, particularly for blood clotting problems, but that's another digression. So the right atrium has got a flap on it. That's called the auricle of the right atrium. And the left atrium has got an even more dramatic flap on it. That is called the auricle of the left atrium. So if I'm pointing to an atrium and I'm saying this specific part or be specific, I'm thinking about the auricles. Right. Now, if we were to open up the heart, and remember the heart is really not this simple, if we were to open up the heart, we would find the inside. And back when you were still inside of your mama, you were not using your lungs. And since you weren't using your lungs, your heart had different connections that are designed to close when you take your very first breaths of life. So as an adult or even as a newborn baby, there should never be blood going from the right side to the left side. Never, ever, okay? But when you were inside of your mom, yes, we were mixing blood like that. And there was a hole right here between your right atrium and left atrium, and it was called the foramen ovale, okay? Remember foramens are holes, right? The foramen ovale was a little hole between the right and left atrium. Normal when you're still inside of your mom, closes with the first breaths of life. When it closes, it becomes a little scar that can still be seen inside of the right atrium. And it is called, once it's closed, the fossa ovalis. Remember, a fossa is a little indentation. So you may have heard of someone whose baby was born with a hole in their heart. And you might be imagining blood like squirting out like that. Yeah, that's not what they mean. When a baby's born with a hole in their heart, it generally means that one of the normal anatomical holes that's there when you're still inside of your mama did not close properly when the baby started breathing, and it usually needs to be corrected with surgery. They'll give it a little bit of time and then correct it with surgery. Okay, so the foramen ovale, make sure you find that when you're looking at the lab models. So right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Great. Yeah, we know that. Now let's look at the major blood vessels. You know the vena cava, right? The vena cava, again, was one of our early labs. Vena cava is the largest vein in the body. It is blue because Most veins are blue, but the reason it's really blue is that blue blood vessels are low in oxygen levels and high in CO2. Okay? Red blood vessels are high in oxygen and low in CO2. None of your blood vessels are high in both. None of your blood vessels are low in both. So that's just little tricks for when you're looking at a quiz or an exam question that you can immediately toss away those answers because it's either low in oxygen, high in CO2, that's the blue blood, or high in oxygen, low in CO2, that's the red blood, right? So let's go ahead and follow what's going on here. The superior vena cava is the vena cava that is above the heart, and the inferior vena cava is the vena cava below the heart. You remember superior and inferior? That was your second lab this semester, right? And those are going to bring blood here into the right atrium. From there, the blood is going to go into the right ventricle, and then it's going to leave through the pulmonary trunk. Technically, that's a pulmonary trunk, but for AP120, I will also accept the term pulmonary arteries, right? Now, here's something that we're going to get our first pass at right now. Generally, you always think of blood that is blue as being in veins and blood that's red as being in arteries. And generally that's true. For most of the system, that is true. The only place where that is backwards is in the pulmonary circulation. What's the pulmonary circulation? It's the blood that's going to the lungs and back from the lungs. So from the heart to the lungs, and then from the lungs back to the heart, that's the pulmonary circulation. Pulmonary refers to the lungs. And the reason that the blood in the artery, remember this is an artery here. Remember the blood that's in the artery is blue, just going to the lungs is because it's still low in oxygen and high in CO2. Well, it hasn't had a chance to pick up any oxygen or drop off any CO2 yet. That's why the heart is sending it to the lungs. Okay? And so the blood's going to go to the lungs, and when it comes back, blood is going to be in pulmonary veins. Okay? And the pulmonary veins are over here. Okay? These are the pulmonary veins. And notice that the blood is red there. Why? Because red blood is high in oxygen and low in CO2. And of course, the blood coming back to the heart from the lungs, of course, is high in oxygen and low in CO2. That's why we sent it to the lungs, is to drop off oxygen and pick up more drop off CO2 and pick up more oxygen. So the blood coming back to the heart is red, even though it's in pulmonary veins. And that's going to go into the left atrium, then down into the left ventricle. And from the left ventricle, it's going to go out through the aorta. And you can't see that here because, structure of the heart's real complicated. It's simple. That's why you really need to study it in lab this week. Okay, one more thing I wanted to tell you before I leave this slide, which is the interventricular septum. This structure, it's made out of muscle, but it's a structure and it's called the interventricular septum. Great, because like inter means between the ventricles, interventricular. And septum means a wall, like the septum in your nose is the wall between the two sides. The interventricular septum is made out of muscle, but it's a wall between the two ventricles. All right, we'll start here at the next video.